Calvin, from John Calvin to Abraham Kuyper and Doyeward and others across the spectrum over the last 500 years or so. That's the tradition, the political tradition that our organization comes out of. And we are unapologetically Christian, and we believe that the God of the Bible has something good to say through his word for all of life, including public life, including political life, law and public policy. That doesn't mean that in order to figure out what the tax code should do with carbon taxes, that you can look it up in Deuteronomy 17 verse 23 or anything like that. But it's that there's principles that God has given us in his word that when we apply them properly, then it will result in human flourishing, not because we're earning our it's not a wealth and prosperity gospel, or a wealth and health gospel. It's a follow the way God has designed things to go, and things will go well with you, generally speaking, certainly as a society. And so we try to do that the best we can. My role within the organization is Director of Law and Public Policy. So I am trained as a lawyer. I did my undergrad at McMaster University in Hamilton and studied religion and classics there. I was actually toying with becoming a pastor, decided to become a lawyer instead. John Calvin did the opposite. He started before and he went pastor. But
either way, it's good.
Yeah, I hope so. Either way, you're dealing with a law, but different kinds of law, I suppose. Yeah, I went to law school here in Ottawa. That's where I am right now. I'm in my office in Ottawa. And then I also did a Master of Laws degree at Osgoode Hall in Toronto in constitutional law, which is kind of my focus. I'm particularly honed on the constitutional questions. I have had the privilege and I'll just say privilege and experience of being able to argue in multiple levels of court, at the trial level, the Court of Appeal level, and at the Supreme Court of Canada on a number of different constitutional cases. And it's a thrill to do that. It's also a privilege to do that. And that's, so I've been for 12 years tracking both cultural changes and more importantly, cultural changes as reflected in law and public policy. The law is it's how culture codifies its values, and if you talk to a friend of mine, Joe Boot, he would say and culture is religion externalized, right? So there's religion, and downstream from religion is culture, and then law is an aspect of culture where we've codified our more important, more fundamental values. And depending on what the religion of our society is, it will affect those laws. And that's what I found to be particularly helpful with Carl Truman. Both of his books I've read this summer. I read The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Some stuff in there I knew already, but really it's a fantastic book to really open my eyes to see just how ideas have consequences, and how the ideas of the last number of centuries have led us to a point where in our culture, a man can say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, and the majority of Canadians or Americans or Europeans say, yeah, that's reasonable. And they don't have to be, an academic to say that's reasonable. They don't have to be a politician or a journalist to say it's reasonable. It can now be a factory worker or a farmer that would say, yeah, whatever, shrug their shoulders, say that's fine. Whereas just 10 years ago, that would have been seen as a flabbergasting statement. And then also so he published that book. Carl Truman published this book in 2020, yes. And so he's now been urged to write a more accessible book called Strange New World. And this is basically a summary or a popular and accessible version of the much more dense book, Rise and Triumph. So I've blended this title of his two books together in my title, Strange New World, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self in Canadian Law and Policy. And it became so clear reading this book. I'm like, okay, now I'm making more sense. I at least understand why and how we can get certain legal decisions, certain bills before Parliament that are worded the way they are. It all clicks now that I've read Carl Truman in a way that, I generally kind of understood it, right? I understand how how sin and evil and temptation and worldliness and all of these sort of things affect the way the human condition is, and how we think through issues. I know all of that, but this made it all the more clear for me. It crystallized it all. So should I just leap right into it,
Yeah,
Don?
I think
then?
so. That's for sure. And we can have
Okay.
time for further discussion afterwards.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
Fine.
So my hope is then, this is my outline, that I'll just touch on a few of the key ideas from Truman's Rise and Triumph textbook. There's so much packed in there that I cannot do at all any justice to it. I'll just touch on a few highlights from him, particularly his idea, well, and he's borrowing it actually from The Secular Age, Charles Taylor's book, The Secular Age, this idea of the social imaginary, and then also engage with what he says about culture and individualism, and then just trace a few of the ideas coming out of his history section on philosophical and psychological ideas. And then in the second part, I want to apply that to Canadian law and policy, and I'm going to apply it in 5 different areas. The structure of the family as we see it in law, how the family relates to itself, also as we see it in law and policy, how the law engages with religious codes and religious institutions, how the law is engaging with pastoral counseling, and then, if we have time, what the law says about prostitution and criminal law, and in particular, a court case that I'm involved in, an organization I work with is involved in there. And then, if we have time, I'd love to hear your questions or discussion, like what you think. Like I realize that I'm presenting to people that I should be sitting at the feet of, learning from. So I welcome your feedback and suggestions for improvement or clarification, that sort of thing. Don and Donald, can you remind me again exactly how should I break down my time? Should I?
Yeah, I would say go to because I would say you can get about 45 minutes here.
Okay.
Really,
yeah.
And then conversation afterwards.
Sounds
but
good.
I guess people can put a question up, or at least make note in the chat if they'd like to formulate a question. Yeah,
that would be great.
Up at the end. Excellent.
Okay, cool. All right. So some of the central ideas, or the ones that I wanted to touch on anyway, from Rise and Triumph, is this idea of the social imaginary, authentic self and the psychological self, expressive individualism, the breakdown of external authority to define identity. So that being in particular, that it used to be that we found our identity from external sources, that the nation that I'm born into tells me something about myself. I'm a Canadian. Or the religion that I'm a part of tells me something about myself. I'm a Christian. The family that I'm born into, which I don't choose, tells me something about my identity. I'm the son of Herman and Christina. And then and how that's flipped around, and now we actually, the source of the authority to define my identity actually comes from within. It's a revolution there. And then also looking at how institutions, culture itself, and codes, particularly religious moral codes, are very oppressive. So let's just look at first this social imaginary idea. It's coming from Charles Taylor and his book A Secular Age. Actually, he's written other books on this idea of social imaginary. And if you've ever scratched your head, as I have, about how conversations around certain subjects seem to be very, very, very polarized, and then they also feel fruitless. Like it's like you're talking like ships passing in the night. You can't, how do you talk to another person when their reaction to what you're saying, and you believe that what you're saying is honest, it's good, it's not supposed to be inflammatory at all, and it's reasonable, that when you share that, the other side reacts so with almost vitriol or hatred, or that's the way it seems. And yet the other side, when they communicate, it sounds to them that they're receiving what you said as if it's vitriol, hatred, bigotry, and so on. And I think Truman does a good job of explaining it's because where we're coming from is based on incommensurate narratives, that our narratives they don't line up, because the assumptions that they're based on around claims to moral truth are fundamentally different. Our claims to moral truth from, I think, a Christian or biblical worldview perspective are completely different than theirs. They would see our claims to moral truth as being expressions of emotional preference. And so and so when we say that perhaps we would say that marriage should be limited to one man and one woman, and exclusively sexual, that the sexual relationship should be exclusive to that relationship, and that it should be committed and lifelong and monogamous and so on. That they would say, well, that's an expression of a personal or emotional preference. And furthermore, when you suggest that ought to be something that I also should consider, that is judgmental, demeaning, and maybe even homophobic and so on. And so how we get there is with this idea of the social imaginary. And he says the way our society thinks is that we make our moral conclusions, or we come to our moral conclusions through intuition that's unconsciously absorbed from the culture around us. And that's what he calls the social imaginary. The vast majority of human beings do not sit down and think through first principles of philosophy and logic and philosophical claims and commitments and work their way through a problem that way. Instead, it's an intuitive response. But how does that intuition get built up? It's unconsciously absorbed from the culture around us. And so Charles Taylor, he defines a difference between social imaginary from social theory. And he says there's three important differences between these two, the social imaginary and social theory. And he says that, well, the social imaginary is the way that ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. So it's not how social scientists would think it through necessarily. It's not the way they would think about society. It's just how the ordinary people imagine things around them being. The second difference is that it and I should also say that includes things like the images and the stories and the legends and so on that are around us, that form our narrative. The second thing that's different is that the social imaginary is shared by large groups of people, maybe even the entire population, whereas a social theory might be the possession of a smaller minority that holds to a particular philosophical view about something. And then the third difference is that the social imaginary represents a common understanding which makes possible common practices, and that gives it this widely shared sense of legitimacy, right? That it's legitimate because everybody thinks this way. Everybody thinks that a man can become a woman, and everybody thinks that is bigotry to suggest otherwise, or intolerance, or some other negative thing. And because everybody's thinking that way, that there's this legitimacy that ends up coming with that idea, which also makes it harder then to critique. It takes more bravery to critique that. So that's coming from Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, page 171 to 172, if you want to read more about that. And that explains a lot, doesn't it? It did for me anyway. It explained a lot about how I could be in a society that I'm looking at the society from one perspective and thinking, don't you understand what's wrong here? That there's something seriously unhealthy with a man who says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. And that the compassionate and loving and thing to do is to say, okay, well, let's do some surgery on your body and let's inject some foreign substances into your body. And that's how we'll help you. And that's, that idea is gained widespread traction. But social imaginary makes it, okay, now I understand why. I can understand why I have why other people might think that way. The second bigger thing that I thought would be helpful to just touch on from Truman's book was his ideas around culture and how it develops authenticity, expressive individualism, and recognition. So the first thing about culture is that culture directs the individual outward. At least that's the way it used to be, that culture directs the individual outward, because the culture is greater than, it's prior to, and it's formative of the individual. The individual is born into a culture. They aren't a culture unto themselves. But of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, certainly after World War II, so in the second half of the 20th century, there's this dramatic turn inward, right? And it explodes onto the scene, I think, especially in the sexual revolution of the 1960s. What happened before that, I get Truman, using the work of not Wilhelm Reich, what's his name? Reich. He talks about that there was once a time when man was seen in his essence, the culture accepted man in his essence as being a political person. He looks to guys like Aristotle, for example, or the Roman Republic. that man in his essence is a political being, and then and that's the most important thing about man, is his interactions in the public square. That changes over time when the culture changes, such that the essence of man is a religious man. You see that particularly, around 400, 500 AD into the 1600s. That man in his essence is religious. That changes again as things change, as culture changes around the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the thought of Marx and so on. Is that man is in his essence an economic man, that he's a consumer and a producer, and that's really key to who he is and what he is. And then we get, and this is all three of those would see man still as outward, right? Outward facing, that he engages. He finds his identity in his outward relationships, and he engages outwardly. But then the last development, the latest development, the man in the 20th century is seen as a psychological man. This is coming out of already ideas that Rousseau is developing in the 1700s, but it really manifests in the ideas of Freud in the early 1900s, and then of course the Frankfurt School, Marcuse and Reich and so on. And that's what feeds a lot of what we now experience in law now and public policy too, is that what's really truly the essence of man is what he feels about himself in the inside. And then this is a quote from Truman, page 63. He says here, the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary prioritizes victimhood, sees selfhood as, in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and places a premium on the individual's right to define his or her own existence. All these things play into legitimizing and strengthening these or those groups that can define themselves in such terms. They capture, one might say, the spirit of the age. So we're going to look at how did we get to this moral structure of our modern social imaginary that prioritizes victimhood and sees selfhood as a psychological thing, and regards these traditional sectional codes as oppressive. Well, we get that through the history of ideas. Ideas, they say, ideas have consequences. My great aunt, Frieda Osterhoff, wrote a book that ideas have a history. So you can see an idea and you can look backwards and you can see its history, and then you can also look forward and see that ideas have consequences. I think, isn't there a book called, there's a book by Richard Weaver called Ideas Have Consequences. So Truman does this great job of looking backwards at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his thought, and how Rousseau and then the Romantics right after him, they do this philosophical shift of understanding human selfhood as the inner self of the individual. They really focus on the inner self. And this is really a really important contribution that Rousseau makes. I'd say it's a very bad contribution that Rousseau makes, because it's produced some harmful results. But he's the one that really kicks that off. If you've ever read a biography of Rousseau, I read a biography once of him, and the man was a narcissist. Like, he was not a pleasant person. Nobody liked hanging around him, and yet he was super, super popular because he was so I don't know, he was very aggressive, and somehow he had a lot of respect, or a lot of people feared him, or what, I'm not really sure, but he was not exactly a pleasant man, right? He writes a book on how we should educate children, when he himself gave up all 5 of his children to an orphanage, abandoned them in an orphanage, where they likely perished in childhood. And why we keep going to him generally as a society to find out how to educate our children is a mystery to me. But he still has that kind of power today. And after him, of course, is the ideas of Marx, of Darwin, and of Nietzsche. And they have ideas that together, Truman says, these philosophers deal a lethal blow philosophically and scientifically to the ideas that nature has an intrinsic meaning, and that human beings have special significance, or an essence that determines how they should behave. Right? Like, from a Christian worldview perspective, a biblical perspective, certainly in our history, in the Christian era, going back 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago or more, we'd say, well, the way you've been created and where you've been placed in society. I don't mean in hierarchy or whatever, but like where you end up, where you're born, and the country you live in, and the family you're born into, and so on. That's going to shape who you are. We just have to bend to that, because that's a reality. And that the world around us and the biological makeup of us has a teleology to it, that it's driving us somewhere, that we're made for something, and that's all undermined by these gentlemen and their ideas. I wish I could go. I mean, like, that's an entire course on each of these men, but so we don't have time to really parse it. But I think Truman does a masterful job of it in the opening two sections of his book. And those ideas feed into or are complemented by the ideas of Freud. Freud, he goes like, if Marx says man is essentially an economic person, and that the essential relationship that we're in is one of oppression, and that all of history is a history of oppression. Freud would say, of course, that man is essentially and at his core a sexual creature. And in fact, he's a sexual creature from infancy. And Freud says that our sexual desires, they're decisive to who we are. And then, and so we as society, we come up with these moral codes that limit our sexual desires. And he says it's actually necessary. He doesn't say it's necessarily a bad thing that we limit sexual desire, because otherwise you get anarchy of sexual desire. We don't want that. And so we have to put up moral codes to contain that. Otherwise, society would implode. But building on Freud and building on Marx, you get the Frankfurt School, where they say, well, Freud is right that we are sexual creatures at our core and from infancy. And Marx is right that we are, we always live in constant oppression or in a relationship of oppression. But we got to blend those two things. And so these two guys, Herbert Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but these two gentlemen, they really take it to the next level. And they say that these sexual codes in and of themselves are oppressive, and they need to be thrown off, because they are evil, they are harmful, they cause damage, psychological harm, they are oppression. And so oppression changes through the thought of these gentlemen from not being things like physical slavery or economic servitude or something of that type, but it can be psychological, that it's psychological oppression. Okay, so these ideas particularly kind of come together in the 1960s and are accelerated over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And I want to show you how. So I want to show you how it's manifesting anyway in Canadian law and policy. So I thought we could start with family structure. And the family has been restructured through law, through Canadian government law. So, what is the family? Well, once upon a time, we would have said the family is the nuclear family. It's a mother and a father, and any natural children that they have, plus any children that are legally adopted into their family. So my family, my husband and a wife, and we have 2 biological children and 1 adopted child, and that's a family. So it's not purely biological in the sense that my adoptive child is my child. She's my daughter. And the government had to be involved in that relationship in order to bring her into our family. But that doesn't change the fact that that's the basic structure of a family, a mother and a father, and any children that they might have. What happens when I was in law school, anyway, I took a family law course. And what they do is they rip apart something that at the core is good by always pointing to the exceptions. Say, well, is that really a family? Doesn't a family include adopted children? And say, yeah, okay, family could include adopted child. Well, what about foster children? Shouldn't you consider the foster child as part of your family, like they're in your home? It's like, yeah, okay, that there's a sense in which a foster child might be part of your family or included in your family. Well, what about extended family? And then what about really, really good friends who eat all of their meals with you and sleep at your house because they're having a hard time in their house? And wouldn't that be a type of part of your family? And they start pulling it apart by always pointing to exceptions, and they miss the core because of the exceptions. And it ends up leading to absurdity, as I'm going to show you. So just a quick history about how the family has been undermined in in law and policy. So this is just Canadian, focusing on Canadian law. So 1968, our marriage law, or divorce law, sorry, was amended by Mr. Trudeau, actually, Mr. Trudeau Sr., Pierre Trudeau. He was the justice minister at the time, and he said, well, divorce is now allowed for marriage breakdown. So it used to be that divorce was only allowed in cases of abandonment. So if usually a man would go and abandon his family, move off somewhere, and it wasn't heard of again, then a woman could go to court and get a divorce for that, in order so that she could marry and find a provider for herself and her children again. And then the second reason that was allowed before 1968 was marital unfaithfulness, in other words, adultery. For those two reasons, divorce was permitted. A third reason was if the marriage had never been consummated, but that's more that you don't really need a divorce there. It was just that, oh, you were never married to begin with. The marriage was never completed. It wasn't consummated. 1968, that changes. They say, well, if the marriage has broken down, then you're also allowed to get divorced. And so they broadened the reasons for divorce. And so what that began to do, some people say, well, that was a good development because there's many abusive relationships and so on. While I don't deny that there would have been abusive relationships, one thing that this does do is it says that marriage is not really till death do us part, through thick and thin, through good days and bad days. It's that it's more of a contract where if one side's not keeping its side of the bargain, we can break it up. And that's undermined a little bit further about 20 years later, 18 years later, when no-fault divorce is introduced, also under, I believe that was also under, that was under Brian Mulroney. I think he was the prime minister then. So no-fault divorce basically said, look, if your marriage is beyond repair and the two of you live separate for a year, that's enough for a divorce. So undermines that lifelong commitment in marriage. About a decade later, we have a court that rules that it's discriminatory to prohibit same-sex couples from adopting a child. What they do here is the court has turned upside down the point of adoption. Right? The point of adoption is it's not about discrimination against the parents, about a same-sex couple. If you say a same-sex couple cannot adopt, you're not discriminating against them, because the point of adoption is not the parent, it's not the adult. The point of adoption is to provide a safe, stable home for a child. And a child does best with a father figure and a mother figure in their life. That from a social science perspective, that's not a controversial thing to say. It's a controversial thing to say from a cultural perspective, but not from a social science evidence perspective. And so when the court said, no, that's discriminatory against same-sex couples, that they can't adopt, then what they say is actually what mums don't matter and dads don't matter, because you can have two dads or you can have two mums, and that's still okay for a child. And then, of course, so I think that was a really big shift right there. It goes to that prioritizes the desires of adults over the needs of children, in my opinion. And then it's no surprise then that 1 decade later, we have same-sex marriage legalized in Canada. It's third country in the world to do so. And so there too, it says that the idea that marriage should be limited to one man and one woman, and that marriage is in fact a societal good, particularly for the benefit of children, that idea gets ripped apart, right? So the teleology, the purpose, the telos of marriage is divorced from marriage. So that marriage is about companionship and about love and about those were the big ones that they come up with, and it's actually not oriented towards children and a stable society. And of course, they would raise questions like, well, what about two people who get married who can't produce children? Is that not a real marriage? And the answer is no, that can still be a real marriage between one man and one woman, because that's what marriage is. It's oriented that way. Whereas if you bless something that is fundamentally incapable of producing any children, that is a problem, right? Yes, not every marriage produces a child, but every child in the entire history of the human race, every child has only ever had one dad and one mom. That's a fact. Exceptional. Adam and Eve are exceptional. They don't count. But everybody else has only ever had one mom and one dad. And if that's true, then it seems to me a bad idea to rip that apart, to undo that, say, well, that, you know, we don't have to really protect that relationship. In 2012, the concepts of gender identity and gender expression were added to the Human Rights Code in Ontario. It was the first jurisdiction to do so, and then it's since spread to I think every other provincial jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction. And what Truman does in his book, he does a great job of it actually in his concluding chapter, pointing out why these categories should not be embraced by Christians. They're social constructs that come out of the revolutionary thought of Rousseau and Marx and Freud and Marcuse, that these are categories of human beings that are not creational. They're not real. They're social constructs, and yet the social imaginary in Canada and in the United States and in Europe is that these are real, that these categories of gender identity and gender expression actually say something essential about who you are. And those are now embedded in law and human rights codes. And then in 2016 in Ontario, we have the All Families Are Equal Act that's passed by the Ontario legislature. In fact, it's passed in just 2 months from it's introduced, debated, and passed into law within 2 months. It's just under 2 months. And it's unanimously supported. There's no real debate or dissent at all on this vote. And this is what it does. Okay, so I have to show it to you with pictures because otherwise you won't quite understand it. So what is the modern family that's produced by Bill 28, the All Families Are Equal Act? What does it do? Well, it says that up to four adults. So here on the screen, you got 1, 2, 3 men and a woman. You can have up to 4 adults who write up an agreement between them called the Preconception Parentage Agreement. And in that agreement, they say, we're going to become parents of children not yet conceived. And in fact, they're allowed to, under the law, not only the 4 of them become parents, but they also could use an anonymous egg donor. They could use an anonymous sperm donor, and they could even use a surrogate. And all of these together can produce a child that's not yet born. And what the All Families Are Equal Act says is, and that's an equal family. That's an equal family to a mom and a dad with their own children. And of course, it's oriented towards the psychological needs or wants or desires of who? Of the adults, right? These adults. It's their desires that drive their decisions around these children. And it completely ignores, in fact, blindsides or stifles any objection that might say, well, wait a second, what do these children need? Don't they have a right to know who their dad is, like their biological dad is? Don't they have a right to know who their biological mom is? Now, there are some exceptional situations where that's not possible, right? A child might be born and their father has been tragically died before they're born, or a child is born and the father is unknown, like due to whatever, maybe, well, who knows? But it could happen. You can imagine it could happen that a father's not known, let's say. But those are exceptions, not something that we should, by design, build into our law. And yet that's exactly what the Ontario government has done. It was the most fundamental restructuring of the family in law, and it took 2 months of debate and passed into law. That's how quick it went. Most people don't even know about this change in the law. One amusing, it would be amusing if it wasn't so serious. One comment that has come up about this particular set of facts is that somebody once asked, well, why 4? Isn't 4 random? Why would the law allow for 4 parents and not a different number? And the answer was, well, any number would be random. And so we had to pick a number. So we picked 4. If anybody stopped and thought for just a moment, they would say, well, wait a second. No, not any number would be random. Every number would be random except for the number 2, right? Because every child has 1 dad and 1 mom. And so it would make sense that that's the only one that's not a random number, would be the number 2. So that's a revolution in the family structure. Family relationships have also been undermined, and coming out of these ideas again of Marx and Freud and Marcuse. Again, remember, they thought that not only were moral codes oppressive, but even the structure of the family itself was oppressive. So So what we get in 2017, the Ontario family law is rewritten through a bill called Bill 89, and it allows the Ontario government and children's aid societies to be able to enter into the family and separate children from their parents if the parents are not, basically if the parents discriminate against their own children on the basis of religion, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and those sorts of things, which again is problematic. What it does is it takes the politicalization of sex and sexual identity, pushes it into the law, and then the law equips government bureaucrats to push that into the family. So a stable family, this won't be an issue, because in a stable family, the CAS won't really come knocking. But if there is trouble in a family, if there is issues, angst, anxiety, whatever, friction between a teenage child, let's say, and their parents, it opens up a door for the politicalization of sex, as we've seen in Marcuse and Freud, to enter into that family relationship. That's very problematic. I'll give you two examples. One is 2019 in a case in British Columbia. This is a British Columbia Court of Appeal decision, AB versus CD. You might have read about it in the newspaper. A father wanted to refer to his daughter as his daughter, biological daughter. She was transitioning. She began that transition behind her parents' back while she was at public school. And that's why we need the third education revolution, by the way. And so the father found out about it after his daughter had started socially transitioning. So a social transition is where you change your name and your clothes and so on. But then the next step is a chemical one, which is when you start injecting the body with opposite sex hormones, synthetic hormones, and so on. And then there's a surgical one that comes after that. That's where you actually remove, in this case would be breast tissue and so on. And so the father said, no, we're not doing this. I'm going to refer to my daughter as my daughter because she is my daughter. I'm not going along with this. And it ended up going to court. And in court, the organization I work for was intervening on the father's side. And on the other side, there was, I think, 11 activist organizations intervening on behalf of the daughter. They said they were supporting the daughter, but really they were supporting this ideology that a daughter who's at the time she began transitioning at 11, the court case happened when she was age 12 years old. I don't know if you know any 12-year-olds. That's not very old at all. And they're saying, no, this daughter should be able to choose for herself whether she's a boy or a girl. Father shouldn't have a say. In fact, in this case, when the father continued to refer to his daughter as his daughter, the lower court, trial court, found him in violation of family law and ruled that he was committing family violence. That was over, that particular question was overturned by the Court of Appeal. They said he's not committing family violence, but they still said that he had to, in public, he couldn't undermine his daughter's decisions. And the other thing that shows you the revolution has taken hold in the courts is there was a question put to the court before the hearing started. And the question was, how should we refer to the child, as male or female? And the court said, before the hearing even began, said, we will refer to this child, which is AB, we will refer to the child as male. And that's crazy, because it's not just crazy because the child is actually biologically female. It's actually crazy from a justice perspective, because there was an obvious neutral option, right? The neutral option is just refer to the child as the child or as AB. That's why we assign those anonymous letters to the child. AB is an anonymized way of referring to the child. So there was no need for the court to say, no, we'll only refer to the child as male. It was not necessary to do that, except that they decided to do that, and therefore the case was lost before it even began. That's the very point of the whole hearing. Is in fact this child a male or a female, and is it reasonable for the father to insist that his child is female? Then in 2021, our parliament in Canada passed Bill C-4, a ban on so-called conversion therapy. I'm going to talk about that as a separate item in a moment. And then 2022, Supreme Court of Canada released this decision, BJT versus JD. So this is a family law case. And they say in law that bad facts make bad law. And this is an example of that. Okay, so this is the case, BJT versus JD. So in family law and so on, they always use anonymized initials to protect children. Okay, so that's a good thing. It's a good practice. It involves a child, 7 years old, and there's a custody battle between him and his father out in Alberta and his grandmother in Prince Edward Island. Okay, and so the question is, who should this child, 7-year-old child, go to? Should he go to his grandmother, live with her, or to his father in Alberta? Facts behind the case: the father didn't even know that his child existed until his child's 5th birthday. The mother is around. This is his mother's mother. So the mother is around, but is incapable of raising the child. Okay, so the child has lived 4 or 5 years with his grandmother in Prince Edward Island. And the lower court says biology trumps, send the child out to Alberta to live with his father. And it gets up to the Supreme Court of Canada. Supreme Court Canada says, no, keep the child with the grandmother. That's where his relationships have begun. That's stable. He knows his grandmother's not a stranger to him, and so on. So I think that the court was right in its outcome. I think that in this case, it was right for the child, who is by now 7 years old, who had a stable relationship with his grandmother. The child's best interest is taken away if you take that child away from the grandmother and the stable environment in which he was living, and so on. But in so doing, they developed bad law. And what I mean by that is, what the court ended up saying is that biology is an empty formula. And they went on to say that biological ties are difficult to articulate, they said, because family institutions have undergone these profound revolution, like I was telling you about earlier. And so they said that what really matters is a close psychological bond. The psychological trumps the biological. And that too, that's coming straight out of Freud, right? 200, 300, 400 years ago, we wouldn't have said that. So bad facts sometimes make bad law, and bad law develops when people forget those underlying principles. But more than that, when judges have, they're part of that same social imaginary, right? That if our general culture, and our judges are part of that culture, if they believe that the psychological is where your real essence lies, and that your biological is an empty formula, then that's the kind of result that you should expect to have. There's also cases involving now, teachers telling grade 1 students and others that there's no such thing as girls and boys. And they're developing teaching resources like the Gender Unicorn. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this yet. This is what it looks like. This is a teaching resource used in public schools across the country, where little students, young students, are told, you've got to figure out for yourself. You have to choose. You have to figure out for yourself what your identity is. So you got to choose one of these 3 spectrums for your gender identity, one of these 3 spectrums for your gender expression. You have to figure out whether or not you're female, male, or intersex. You have to figure out who you're physically attracted to and who you're emotionally attracted to. And you got to, slide these sliding things all over that scale, so that there's a infinite number of identities that you could come up with, depending on where exactly you put yourself on any one of these sliding scales. And it puts a profound amount of anxiety on little children, so that little children are having a really hard time knowing, well, who am I? We used to have it 250 years ago that who you are was answered by, well, you're Canadian because you're born in this nation, and you're Christian if you're born into a Christian faith, or Muslim or Jew or whoever, and you're the son or the daughter of your dad and your mom. Like, there you go, 3 important aspects to your identity. That's who you are, and you don't have to ask any of these other questions. That's all gone now, and it's pressed on little kids. In fact, these ideas are pressed on even kindergarten kids and kids before that. So check this out. This is a little short video from Blue's Clues. So Blue's Clues is a very popular show for age 2, 3, 4 children, and they ran an episode where they sing the ant school marching one by one, except it's a pride parade instead.
Look at all these families! Hi, families! It's time for a pride parade. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 mommies. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade.
I'm gonna spare you watching the entire video. You can find it on YouTube if you want to watch the whole thing. They go all the way up to 10, and they describe all kinds of different families. And that relates right back to the Ontario All Families Are Equals Act, right? Like, we got to celebrate all of these different arrangements of people, and we're going to call them all lovely families. And it's all about love. Love is love is love. there's nothing deeper than that really that's discussed. And so that also feeds that social imaginary, right? If little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are being told this through their entertainment, we shouldn't be surprised that gets inculcated into the psyche of individuals. Okay, I am rapidly running out of time, so I got to keep it moving here. On religious codes and institutions, I'm going to focus on just 2 examples. The first one is Trinity Western University proposed to have a law society, a law school, a number of years ago, and the Law Society in Ontario and the Law Society in British Columbia denied recognizing their students as being properly taught or properly educated. And so so the law school, or the potential law school, Trinity Western, challenged this in court and said, hey, they're violating our freedom of religion. Okay, so it makes it all the way it goes in it was actually in Nova Scotia, Ontario, and BC. So Trinity Western won in both courts in BC and in both courts in Nova Scotia, but they lost in both courts in Ontario. And so it eventually makes it to the Supreme Court of Canada. So in Ontario, at the Court of Appeal, paragraph 115 of the decision. So I argued for ARPA Canada in an intervention in that case. So I wasn't arguing for Trinity Western. I wasn't representing Trinity Western, but I was arguing for ARPA Canada, who I work for, as an intervener in the case. So weighing in on the broader issues. And this is how the Ontario Court of Appeal, they said this: I have no hesitation saying that TWU's admission policy, viewed in conjunction with the community covenant, discriminates against the LGBTQ community on the basis of sexual orientation, contrary to Section 15 of the Charter and Section 6 of the Human Rights Code. Okay, so community covenant, these are one of those moral sexuality codes that, you know, Marcuse and Freud and Nietzsche and others are so upset about. They don't like those codes because those codes are inhibiting. They limit the authentic self, to borrow from Rousseau, and so we need to do away with them. They do violence, according to Marcuse. They do violence to the essence of a person, especially a sexual minority. The curious thing, the reason I'm sharing this paragraph, is because this is fundamentally bad law, and that's not just my opinion. Like, if I wrote this on my first year constitutional law exam in law school, I would have failed my exam. It's that bad. It really is. Because you can't say that the admission policy discriminates against the LGBTQ community on the basis of sexual orientation, contrary to Section 15 of the Charter. The reason you can't say that is because the Charter does not apply to Trinity Western. Trinity Western is a private religious institution. It only applies to the government. Like, that's Charter Law 101. Like, it's the first thing they teach you in law school. And then you also can't say that it discriminates contrary to Section 6 of the Human Rights Code, because the Human Rights Code has another section in it. It's a different number depending on which province you're in. But another section says, well, there's a limit to discrimination. Discrimination, if you're actually associating around a particular belief, so if you're a religious organization or a cultural organization, then obviously you can limit your hiring or limit your practices or limit your services to people of your community, right? That makes obvious sense. If I'm running a housing project for Indigenous youth, and you have to be Indigenous to work there, that's not discrimination. That's association around Indigenous identity. And that's clear in the Human Rights Code. If the Court of Appeal had actually stopped and done the test that comes in law with the Section 6 test or the Section 15 test, they would have figured that out. But they don't need to do that, because the social imaginary says, oh no, any limitation, even if it's a community covenant of an evangelical community, if it puts a limit through a moral code on unhindered sexual expression, then it's automatically discrimination. We don't have to think about it. We don't even have to do a legal test about it. It's instinctive. They write this instinctively. And so, and the reason I say it's not just my opinion is because the dissent at the Court of Appeal, at the Supreme Court of Canada, agrees with the point I'm just making. They point out that JA stands for appellate judge. So McPherson, who wrote that decision that I was just critiquing, his finding that TWU's admission policy, viewed in conjunction with the community covenant, discriminates against the LGBTQ community, It reveals the fundamental and serious error in the Court of Appeals understanding of that balancing exercise, paragraph 115. TWU is a private institution, and at the risk of stating trite law, private actors are not subject to the charter. So unfortunately, though, that was the dissent. There's only 2 lawyers that dissented in that case. The other 7, they all said that, yeah, the law societies were reasonable in not allowing TWU to be accredited, which is phenomenal because it wasn't based on law. They were willing to change the law in order to suit where the social imaginary is at, where if even a private religious community limits sexual expression, that is such an egregious wrong, it does such profound harm that we can't tolerate it. And I'll give you, do I have time? I don't have time.
Yeah, by all means, go ahead.
Well, so this is a quick clip. This is from the beginning of the hearing at the Supreme Court to give you a flavor of where one of the judges is at. So the judge that ends up interrupting and then asking a convoluted question is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. Okay, so this is, just listen to how he reacts right at the beginning of the hearing to the lawyer for Trinity Western
University et al. We'll call on you first, Mr. Boonstra.
Chief Justice, Justices, I rise this morning to make a brief opening on behalf of Trinity Western University and Braden Volkanant. This opening applies to both appeals that are before you today, and I will not repeat the comments that I make in my brief opening this afternoon when I bring my submissions in the British Columbia appeal. And after my opening, Mr. Staley will address the Ontario appeal. What the law societies had to decide was whether they would accept graduates from a Trinity Western School of Law for the purposes of admission to the bar. The question for these appeals is whether and to what extent the evangelical Christian community that exists at Trinity Western University will be respected and accommodated by the law societies in making that determination. And that question has to be...
I'm sorry to interrupt you at this time, is that the only question really an issue? Because if you can bear with me just for a second, it seems to me that it's more complicated than that. In other words, your client, Trinity College, as a well-known school, has a special covenant, special program, according to which a student has to accept the conditions of this covenant. And so students who don't share the same sexual orientation has 2 choices. First, he or she has to hide a real sexual orientation, and which is not really a good thing, and which will bring some pain and suffering, and could attack the human dignity, or could decide not to attend the school. That's one thing. But the other thing is Trinity College.
So I'm not sure if you caught that there, but he said, you know, if a student applies to this school and they agree to abide by this covenant, they have to hide their identity as a sexual minority, and that will do profound harm, damage, I think he said, to them or to their human dignity, right? So he's completely on board with what Truman is explaining in this book, and where our social imaginary is at. The judge doesn't need proof of that. He just knows it to be true because that's where our cultural narrative tells us is true. And I'm not saying that, you know, the code wouldn't cause some anxiety or something of that sort for a person who identifies as being a lesbian or a gay individual. You know, I don't want to pretend that there's nothing to that. The point is rather that this is an example of a judge making a comment that completely corresponds to what Truman is telling us is going on culturally, morally, legally in our country. And you know, Justice Campbell, who decided the Trinity Western case in Nova Scotia Supreme Court, he has a beautiful line in there. It said, the charter is not a blueprint for moral conformity. But in fact, that's exactly what it's become with Trinity Western decision by the Supreme Court of Canada. They said, well, actually, the charter is, because we're going to say this non-discrimination clause, it's the ultimate good. And so we are willing to force moral conformity around these moral codes by eliminating these moral codes, these moral sexual codes. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna use the charter to justify that. The one other example I wanted to give under institutions here is the example of Service Canada and the Canada Summer Jobs grants.
Yeah.
And there's many cases of this, but there was a case just recently where a church had applied for, they had a few interns, and the interns were going to help the church feed the homeless in their community. And so they applied for Canada Summer Jobs funding from the federal government, which is given through Service Canada. And Service Canada, they replied and they said, well, we found information in the public domain. In other words, they went snooping around on the church's website that raises concerns regarding your eligibility. A review of your website's belief statement indicate that we believe, so the church believes, God's word teaches and confirms that marriage is the union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. And then they said, and this is cut straight from their letter to the church, denying them funding, says this raises concerns that the project or job activity restricts access to employment contrary to applicable laws on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. This also raises concerns regarding the measures to provide a workplace free of harassment and discrimination implemented by your organization. In other words, because you as a church believe God's word and what it says about marriage, we, Service Canada, feel that you will be unable to provide a workplace that's free of harassment. Right? That's what they say in their letter. And that too, that's what that's a Marcusean idea, is that if you believe certain things about a moral code, that belief in itself is damaging. It's oppression, it's psychological harm, it's harassment. Harassment, it being like verbal abuse or, unwanted sexual touching, that sort of thing. That's what we used to mean by harassment. Now it's you having a public statement somewhere about what you believe about marriage to be, that constitutes harassment. So you can see how the ideas that Truman is explaining in his book are manifesting in the last couple of years. Very briefly on pastoral counseling then. Bill C-4 is a criminal law bill to ban so-called conversion therapy. The preamble is what shows us that this is a religious document. It's a new religion, that being secular humanism, which I think is behind what our social imaginary is accepting as true, right? This is what the preamble says: whereas conversion therapy causes harm to society because, among other things, it's based on, propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including the myth that homosexuality, cisgender, gender identity, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. So look at this word preferred. Like if you read Truman's book, he talks about that moral codes are now seen as expressions of preference, right? And that's exactly the language that's here. Or that our biblical view of sexuality and identity is, well, it's merely a myth that you're propagating, and it's not just any myth. It's not just an idea that you're sharing. It's causing harm to society, these myths. Again, that Marcusean, Freudian, Rousseauian ideas here. And so it's important, they say, that we denounce this in order to protect human dignity and equality. And so they in the law, they end up banning conversion therapy, but they define it so broadly that it includes any practice or treatment or service that's designed to change sexual orientation, change gender identity or expression, or reduce sexual behavior or expression. And even that, like the last one is pretty radical, because what it's saying is that if you simply are providing a practice or a treatment that helps somebody just reduce unwanted sexual behavior, if that sexual behavior is homosexual behavior, then you're providing conversion therapy. It's very broad definition. And look at the language that Justice Minister Lametti uses to describe that kind of thing. This very broad definition of conversion therapy. Pastoral counseling would be caught in that if your pastoral counseling is helping somebody to reduce an unwanted sexual behavior. Listen to how he describes it.
As the UN saw it, these so-called therapies may amount to torture. No matter your age, torture is something you cannot consent to. Just consider what these so-called therapies do. Their goal is to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, or their gender identity or expression to match the sex they were assigned at birth. In other words, change a person into something or someone they are not.
Okay, so I think that last phrase is, so two things, right? The torture thing, again, Mark Hughes. But the second thing is change them from something that they are into something that they are not. That's what pastoral counseling amounts to, they say. Mr. Lemedi is saying. But exactly, like that's the problem, is that, well, you have to accept Freud's idea of what it means to be someone in the first place, that you are in your essence a psychological sexual being and not something more. That if you were to help persons shape the way they think about their identity or the way they act out in particular sexual ways, that in itself is an attack on their essential humanity. It's torture, says Mr. Lemedi. And so that's the problem there. Skipping ahead to the last one, prostitution and criminal law. Very briefly, this was in the courts just last month. I was in Ontario Superior Court, Divisional Court in Toronto 3 weeks ago, I think. In a court case that's trying to strike down the prostitution law. So the prostitution law in Canada currently targets purchasers. It's a new law. The law which just changed six or 7 years ago. Big fan of it. I think the new law is a good one. So I hope it'll withstand challenge. So the law targets purchasers, so pimps and johns. That's what its focus is on, and it actually gives immunity to people who supply their own bodies for sale. And the idea behind it is a basic economics idea. We want to reduce demand in order to reduce the supply, right? If you target pimps and johns, if a john knows he's going to get hammered by the criminal law for purchasing sex, he's less likely to do it. That means you reduce the demand. If you reduce the demand, less people will want to provide sex. So they want to eliminate it as much as possible. As I mentioned, it gives immunity to sellers in order to give them protection, so that if they're being abused or trafficked or whatever, they're not afraid to go to the police for help. That's the whole point. And this law sees the sex trade itself as inherently exploitative. Okay. So what was interesting to me, having just read Carl Truman's book over the summer, is that I'm sitting in the courtroom and there's a ton of interveners in this court case. Organizations that are intervening, saying either we really need to keep this law because it's good for all of society, and particularly the women that we represent, or saying we need to strike down this law because it's really bad for society, particularly the women we represent. And there's a group of 10 organizations on the left side of the screen. All of them would stand up and make their argument. And they were like, so Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, it's like the leading legal feminist organization in the country. They're saying, the law itself is oppressive. Eliminate the law and things will be all hunky-dory for women who engage in sex work. Or the Black Legal Action Center said, Black women are overrepresented in the sex trade. We need to eliminate the law because the law is oppressive. That way, if we get rid of the law, then things will be okay for Black women who are in the sex trade. Or the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, same thing. We represent migrant workers in Canada, and the law is oppressive. If we get rid of this law, then things will be good, and we'll be allowed to engage in sex work freely and carefully and safely and so on. So they see the law as oppressive because they say, well, if the law says it's illegal to purchase sex, it's making a moral judgment, it's a sexual code, it's limiting free sexual expression. And therefore, that law in itself must be oppressive and it has to go. Instead, the organizations on the right side of the screen, which I would agree with, are saying, no, it's not the law that's oppressive. It's the sex trade that's oppressive. It's the sex trade itself that undermines the equality of women. It's the sex trade itself that violates their dignity. It's the sex trade that we need to eliminate, not the law. The law is trying to eliminate the sex trade. And that clash there was remarkable, that difference. So the decision has not been released on that case yet, but I'm going to be definitely looking to see how does the judge deal with this. I'm going to leave it there. Truman does end his book on a not super optimistic note, I gotta say, but he does end with an encouraging word to the church. And I'll just pop those 5 words up on the screen, just so they're thoughts for you as we end and wrap up here. One is that expressive individualism, while it's led to some crazy things, it's not an unmitigated evil. There is something about the individual that is worth celebrating, worth embracing, right? God makes each of us unique. And that's really cool. That's really special. And we can embrace that a little bit more instead of trying to force people into particular boxes. So we should be open to that without going, whole hog on it. The other side is not about behavior, but identity. And we need to be recognize that, right? I know that for me, for the last 12 years working in this, I want to focus on behavior over identity. But if we don't understand that the other side is coming at this as an identity question, and not a behavior question, then we're going to be missing each other completely. The connection between aesthetics and core beliefs, he has a little word in there about that. The last 3, items 4, 5, and 6 are really important. He said for us to move forward and survive as a church in North America and in Europe, we must be a community. We must recover a high view of the human body and natural law. And we have to see ourselves as a marginal sect in a dominant pluralist society, similar to the church in the 2nd century, actually. And said, but if we look at that church, we know that it survived by the grace of God, and so can we. I'll end it there. Sorry for going over time.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Andre. Very comprehensive, very disturbing presentation too. I'd like to open up for comments and reflections. I have a lot, but I'll hold back. Truman does have a series of lectures he's done at Grove City that's available online that may be helpful by way of introducing some of this material.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I'll share that link with you. I don't have it right up hand, but I will share that. But let me open it up to others. I mean, this is profoundly disturbing, to say the least. And how did we get here? Where was our church leadership? How did we go this far? But yes, can I open up your thoughts and reflections? I know, Stephen, I mean, the Zimmerman's book, Family and History, of course, is an important frame of reference that's completely lacking within our educated elite, apparently. But yeah, comments and thoughts, because there's a lot here, and obviously we're going to have a follow-up session for sure. Oh, Sam, good to see you there. Sam's a neighbor of mine up in Ancaster, so pleasure to have you here, Sam.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to hear all the things that's going on in society in general, and to hear biblical worldview and how we can actually deal with this. I just went out to pick up the kids, hence my video was off.
Okay. You got your hands full. Hey there. What's your daughter's name? Hey.
Hi.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
You just mentioned Zimmerman.
Yeah.
I ran across my copy, pulled it out of the box this morning. So
yeah, and that's in a good reprint edition with a good friend of Stephen's having done the introduction to that, if I'm not mistaken. So, but I think yeah, that's just that we've gone so far in one direction. It's a bit like a ratchet. Every turn, you can't go back. Turn. At what point, do we reach a crisis point? That's. But yeah, thoughts and comments. I know a lot of you have thought and written. Isa.
Hi. I haven't read Truman's book yet. I have it, and now I'm wondering if I should buy the condensed version with I didn't read Charles Taylor either, but of course there are some good books that really summarize it and deal with it from a Christian perspective, and I thought they were very helpful. My question is basically in my personal thinking and processing of what's going on in cultural trends, and so there's a kind of a misconnect or a disconnect rather with where my thinking was going and what I have heard from various sources and read in various articles and such, and that is actually Vishal Mangalwadi gets into it just for a little bit in one of his books on the impact of the Bible, where he talks about, he says, no, Freud says, comes from a materialistic and a naturalistic perspective. And he says, so if you have a dream, it cannot be a spirit or a God that is communicating this to it. So this must be yourself. And if that is yourself, then that's who you really are. So you're kind of confused. And then if you have this dream, this is confirming who you are. Because the question that I don't hear a lot is if let's say a teenage girl comes all of a sudden to the idea that she's actually a male, where does it come from? Obviously, it doesn't come from looking at her body. So where does this feeling come from? And of course, it's influenced by culture. And so by hearing others forcing her to say, well, like, don't take it for granted. You got to explore all options, possibilities. But, if I read scripture, and I read quite often and regularly in Old Testament and New Testament about deceiving spirits. And Romans 1, when a culture, and I read it as not just a person, but when a culture, turns its back from, away from God, then it's going to believe the lie. And you see passages where say when people turn away from God, like give them over to Satan. So I really kind of become convinced that what's going on is kind of what Revelation talks about the end of the days, that there's these frogs, like, these deceiving spirits that go out. And just when you see with Ahab, when he comes to the end of his life, God says, enough is enough with destroying my kingdom. I'm going to give him over to this deceiving spirit. That's going to be his death. That's going to be his end. So what I have mentioned in various circles in the church and with international students here in Hamilton, I said, look, if you refuse to look at yourself and how you have been treated, in your home and in your community earlier, and all of a sudden you start to believe this dream that you've had, and that is going to be your true identity that apparently cannot change, then what kind of basis is there? Because it's like when I talked one time to somebody who was New Age, they said, how do you know that what these spirits or these in the seances and these communicators with the spirit world, how do you know that these are true and reliable? God's word says we must test the spirits. And I keep thinking, like, we've got to train our children and young people in the church, like, that there are deceiving spirits. I've got this book about the brass heaven that, even the church really secularized and doesn't really believe there's the, evil spirits and stuff that exist. That's what they believed in Martin Luther's time. And so do you have something for me that you say, yeah, this is an important component and we should deal with it, or you're on the wrong track for this reason?
Well, speak.
Yeah. Oh, that's I like your thoughts there. And I think that definitely that's an important element. I remember when I was doing my articles, so to become a licensed lawyer, you do 3 years of law school and then you do 1 year of co-op. It's called articling. And when I was doing my articles, I finished my articling up with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And I remember that my articling principal told me, and it's always stayed with me, is that she said, never forget the work that we do is spiritual warfare. And that means that that you have to be on guard for what the spirits around us are doing or trying to manipulate or whatever. And I come out of a tradition where, like you mentioned, at least when I was growing up and when I went to school, I went to a Christian school, but yeah, we didn't take that side of things all that seriously. We certainly didn't talk about it all that much. And so what I think is good with Truman in his book is that he shows what the history of the deceiving spirits are. Like, you can't, I think that when I look around at things like how the Bill C-4 vote, the vote on the criminalization of conversion therapy, how that happened, like, I don't how things in the global order have rolled out over even the last 3 years and more, I would say that is not something that human beings can coordinate. We're not that smart, we're not that clever or that capable. There has to be other powers at work, ones that have lived for a very, very long period of time, right? Demons and Satan himself, of course, are very old. I don't know how old they are, but at least 6,000 years old, I'm guessing. And so they've been around a long time, and they're roaming the earth, and they're working there, under constraint from God, but God has allowed them to still wander and roam. And I think that has to be part of the element, but that's an element of this whole struggle. And so I don't think Truman, like when he writes this book, actually, he's a seriously orthodox, small orthodox Christian thinker, and a phenomenal teacher. But when he writes this book in particular, he said, look, I'm just trying to be as objective as I can to answer the question, how did we get to this point? From kind of like a historical philosophical perspective. So he doesn't delve into that spiritual aspect at all. At least I don't remember him doing so in the book. But he certainly, my guess is that if you sat down and talked to him, he certainly wouldn't deny that that's the power behind what we read about in this book. And that's where, I would on my last slide there, is that for the church to survive as this marginal sect in a dominant pluralistic society, it has to be a church at prayer. Because if we're not a church at prayer, then we're gonna deceive ourselves and think that, oh well, if we just think a little bit more clearly and engage a little bit more winsomely and just beware, teach our kids a bit more about Rousseau and Marcuse and so on, then we'll be okay. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is actually first and foremost, it's a church at war in a spiritual sense. So we need to equip our children and each other with that kind of a mindset. So thank you very much for that comment. I think that's bang on.
I think it would be important to just call the thing for what it is, especially also with parents and with the teenagers. As in Ephesians, where the spiritual armor, we're not fighting against people and politicians, we're fighting against the demonic forces behind it. It's very clear there what Paul is warning us for. And then I think it's actually empowering. I'm thinking about Osgoode. Well, that's from his book. That's a long time ago, but he was having a speech presentation or conference about the New Age. And then actually the family or the church family back home had this vision about a woman sitting in the audience, and she got very upset and afterwards said, what did you do? Because I was going to put the cast, I kind of, something demonic in you, and I was powerless. And, if we say in the church and from scripture, this is reality, I think we need to also weaponize ourselves in such a way that we talk about these things and verbalize it, because if that apparently, the experience from Osgoode shows that actually that this is helping us, this part of the warfare or part of the armor that we can use. Yeah, that's.
I was thinking about.
Harold's going to come. Yeah, go ahead. Please.
Let me ask, Philip Hamburger wrote a book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And it occurs to me that much of what's going on in Canada is really administrative law rather than constitutional law. Is this a pattern that you see at work with cases like this? Mm-hmm. And what is then the relationship between administrative law and Canadian constitutional law? Or I've come to see it almost as a cocoon that conceals much of our Constitution in many respects. And is this going on in Canada as well?
Really?
Yep. So thank you very much for that question. I have the book that you're just talking about,
Well, let's see.
administrative,
Yeah.
Okay, that's all right.
is administrative law unlawful? Yeah, so that's an excellent question. The definitely since I wonder if there's a connection because 1960s is the explosion of the sexual revolution, and basically all of the ideas that Truman's talking about leading up to the 1960s really manifest starting in the 1960s moving forward. But that's also when you get the explosion of the administrative law So constitutional law is with the bigger constitutional questions of like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the division of powers between the federal government and the provincial government, and the role of the judiciary versus the executive versus the legislature. Those big, how do we govern ourselves kind of questions. Administrative law is the law that governs the relationship between government actors and citizens. And that body of law, that area of law has exploded. It's huge. It's a huge field of law. And it's because the bureaucracy is a huge body of people. So at the federal level, and this does not include the RCMP, it does not include the military, and it doesn't include crown corporations. So excluding all of those people, the federal bureaucracy has over 320,000 employees. If you look at the province of Ontario, the province of Ontario employs over 600,000 employees. They make up 11% of the workforce in the province of Ontario, right? So if there's that many people working for the government, and there's all of these administrative bodies, we call it an administrative law, the ABCs, agencies, boards, commissions, and tribunals, and they're interacting with citizens all the time, then it's that area of law that's administrative law. And that's what TWU was dealing with. So TWU, that court case that I talked about that went to Supreme Court, it's constitutional law because it raises a fundamental constitutional question, freedom of religion. But it's also more an administrative law case. And that's how it ended up getting decided, because under administrative law, the question is, did the administrator, in this case, the Law Society, did the administrator make a reasonable decision, all things considered? That's really, if you boil it down, that's really what it comes down to, is it a reasonableness question? And the answer was, yeah, it's reasonable. It's reasonable to say we're not going to grant accreditation to Trinity Western University because look, they limit membership to they eliminate sexual minorities from attending their schools is the perception. Whereas if it's a constitutional question and a charter rights question, then it should have actually been a correctness question, which is it correct in law? Is it reasonable and justifiable in a free and democratic society to say no to this Christian institution, which should be a higher standard? All of that, I could go on and on about this topic. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, the difference between administrative law and constitutional law, and that we're not holding the government to the higher standard of constitutional law and charter law because of administrative law. But that might be an entire course on its own. Yeah. You've heard of it. It's the new catechism is called the New Reformation Catechism on Human Sexuality. So I don't know, as a pastor, how familiar you are with, there's a new city catechism that Tim Keller's produced, I think. There's I'm a huge fan of the Heidelberg Catechism from 1536 or something like that. It's the New Reformation Catechism on Human Sexuality. I'm almost positive that's its title, and it was just produced this year. And I think it's a solid resource, and that churches should be using a tool like that. It doesn't have to be that one, but you could use a tool like that to teach our young people. Because the thing about a social imaginary is that so they say, being forewarned is forearmed. Is that the saying? Something like that. Yeah. So that means our children, if we don't bother equipping them to think about this stuff until it's like, okay, they're university age now we should start teaching them. That's too late, because the social imaginary, their intuitions have already been shaped by the culture around them. It's too late. We got to start at a much younger age, and we have to expect more from Christian youth than the public system expects of our youth. And so that gives us a leg up. That's good news right there, because when we see our little children, we see image bearers of God who are capable of great things, that they're little creators. They're they can do wonderful things if we're willing to push them a little bit harder. And so I think approach them at a young age to inculcate a truly biblical view of identity. And I think what Strange New World, coupled with that new Reformation catechism, does is it gives us a tool to understand like these are the pressing issues today. This is the way our culture around us thinks today, so that we can prepare them to be better able to withstand the fiery darts of today. So I think that we can teach them other doctrine as well, doctrines around our sacraments, for example, or doctrines around theological issues. But the urgency behind those is somewhat less. I got to be careful here. But what I mean by that is you have, they're not getting a ton of pushback on the particular doctrines around sacraments, for example, because the rest of our culture isn't even, they don't think about Lord's Supper or baptism. So I'm not saying don't teach that. I'm just saying the urgency isn't there. You've got time to teach that, but really what you don't have time to teach, like time is running out to teach, is on questions of identity. What does it mean to be human? We need an anthropology course taught by our church to our young people and to everybody else, frankly. Like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be an image bearer of God? What does it mean to find our identity in the work and person of Jesus Christ? Answer that question. We're giving them hope for a better identity than what our culture is telling us.
Indeed. Go ahead. I think one more question and comment, and there are the further chat questions and some links in there as well that will be shared with you following the session.
Okay.
And I think probably follow up in terms of resources to really address this at the front lines, at the issue, at the level that needs to be dealt with to really engage and preserve the coming generation. They have to start very young. I was just reading in Matthew last night how much Christ talks about taking little children in his lap, and it must be his lap, and how serious it is to harm the little children. It says better have a millstone put around your neck and hurled in the sea than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. So we're dealing with a very targeted, I think, as was mentioned, attack on the very core elements of what it means to be human at the youngest age, the most vulnerable ages now, and that's something we need as a church and a community to address for sure.
No, absolutely. I think Justin's question.
Yes.
I think that one. I think it's an excellent question, and I don't really know how to get. I don't know if we've developed that alternative vocabulary. I'm all ears. I think that we ought to be. One point that I would make in relation to that question about developing an alternative vocabulary so as not to capitulate to the social constructs of gender expression and gender identity or sexual identity is that we need to do our very best to stop using those categories in the first place. So obviously the question is assuming that we stop using them or don't use them. And Truman in his last chapter, he urges us not to as well. But there's a ton of Christian institutions that do. They embrace them wholeheartely. They work them into their safe school policies, for example, or they work them into their, statements of faith. They'll have a statement of faith on sexuality, and they'll use terms like this. But if you use a term like this, the culture has a different understanding of what you mean by gender expression and sexual identity than you do. And so I think that if we use the language of the revolution, that's going to be problematic. So we have to think of ways to talk about it differently. But I think talking about having a complex identity, that there's many aspects to our human identity, what makes us us. I think that we can talk about that. We can talk about the uniqueness of individuals. Professor David Koises has a book, Political Visions and Illusions. And one of the things I learned from that book that I thought was very, very helpful is at the beginning how various political philosophies idolize one aspect of something, right? And I think that's helpful because then the other thing he says is that there's always also a nugget of truth in a lot of them, right? Like Marx is not 100% wrong. He's just mainly wrong. And then there's a nugget of truth in there. Well, the nugget of truth that's in the LGBTQ movement is that of uniqueness in our personal identity. And I think that we can embrace that one a little bit more. I think that's what Truman's saying in his last chapter about, expressive individualism is not a total unmitigated evil. There's something there that we can embrace. And maybe that comes in on this question from Dr. Cooper, I think, perhaps. But I don't know if there's other terms to use beyond male and female. And then talking about our identity generally, just better. Just talk about our identity better. Yeah.
Well, that could be an assignment for the next. And Stephen, and then I'll so we should close it now, the conversation. But continue, Stephen. Yep, go ahead.
I was going to say the nugget of truth takes me back to a film version of the book Disinformation. Right. Jan Pachepa and Ron Rishlak, which I strongly recommend because the KGB mastery of disinformation is something that's very much with us. It's not going to go away.
Yeah, good point. I have both the video and the book. That's very profound. Look, I thank you. We've obviously got a lot more to discuss, much work to do, and we'll follow up with some references from this conversation. And this is just beginning, obviously. I think reading Truman's book is all of a sudden you get that aha experience. So this is how this all fits together. It makes sense. And now we have to develop a strategy to really articulate what's true about us as image bearers of God in this context. And no small tasks. When you list the number of persons working for the Ontario government, blows my mind. The federal government, we're talking about over 1 million people kind of devoted to the administrative side of kind of how this law is. And if their imaginary is so filled and gone in this direction, we've got our hands full very much, clearly. Well, thank you, Andre, for your time with us, and everyone for your participation and comments that are in the chat. Indeed, well, thank you, and God bless you and your work and everyone here. And I did think I have most of you in the email list, but I'm going to be having a session early in the new year on transhumanism by a woman who's just published a book on that, and it's very profound. This is another aspect of this broader picture that we're dealing with here. So again, thank you so much, and we will stay tuned. To say we've got a number of we're working on the schedule for the coming year, and there'll be some important speakers. And I think Andre will probably have you back again to pick up where we're going to leave off this evening. So thank you so much. All right.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, indeed. And I'll get the recording. Andre, is it possible also to have the PowerPoint with this just separately? If you email that to me, I might. It's useful just by way of a refresher and a reminder.
Yeah, I can send that along on a non-publication basis, right?
Just for internal use. And I'll share the link too of the series of lectures at Grove City that Truman has given on this topic, and they're broken down as about 10 of them. It's very manageable. And it may be a good way to introduce some people, because I know the book, I'm listening to it on audiobook. I find I absorb certain things better that way, but it's a very important book. Excellent. Okay, well, again, thank you for your time. And Justin, good to see so many familiar faces. Sam, who was here before, is actually a very interesting connection through the Third Education Revolution. And he's in Ancaster, so we'll follow up and meet with him. Jerry, good to see you, of course, and we'll keep in touch and perhaps talk offline as well. Okay, God bless. Yeah, and Justin and I will, I'm working on my project description. I have something pretty soon to get to you and the others. And I did get your comments, so we'll, that's what's really keeping me busy now after I've cleared my plate with some other things that I have to do. You're back, and wait a minute, pause. Sorry, just 1 second. I just wanted to stop.
Yeah, no, I am back, and I did read, I think sent an email on what you've done to date. So look forward to getting kind of the nuts and bolts to go with the legal framework, but
Exactly.
what you have is well done so far.
Yeah, I think George has embraced this with considerable enthusiasm, and he's worked through what is a CADE application form that I'm going in, and then there's the papers, the two small pieces that really describe the Christian Worldview Hub as a project of Hope Center. So a lot there. I feel like I'm writing a dissertation sometimes. I'm but it's getting to a point where it's ready to share and discuss and forward. So thank you very much.
Encourage you to move forward, Don. It's getting exciting.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think we need to create spaces where we can really have serious discussions, both online and in person. So, okay, all the best.
All right.
We'll
Okay.
talk. Yep. Bye then.
Bye-bye.